A homeless boy offered to fix a millionaire's luxury car, who laughed. But when the boy did the unthinkable, tears fell and their lives changed forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. The light March rain fell over Los Angeles like silent tears, creating small puddles that reflected the neon lights of Rodeo Drive. At Sanders Luxury Cars, located on one of the most prestigious corners of the West Side, the aroma of Italian leather and automotive polish mixed with the damp smell of wet asphalt. Through the enormous glass windows, the cars gleamed under the halogen lighting like precious jewels in a showcase of dreams. Elizabeth Sanders adjusted her navy blue Armani blazer and ran her hand through her perfectly styled brown hair, trying to disguise the fatigue she felt after yet another sleepless night. At 40, she carried the weight of a legacy spanning 3 generations, inherited from her father, who had died 2 years prior in a car accident, ironically, while driving one of the very vehicles he sold. Her delicate yet firm hands held a steaming cup of coffee as she watched the morning hustle of the dealership from her second-floor office window. "Ms. Elizabeth, there's a boy here at the reception asking to speak with you." The hesitant voice of Mark, the 20-something receptionist, echoed through the intercom, laden with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. Elizabeth furrowed her brow, checking her schedule on her tablet. "I don't have any appointments scheduled for this morning, Mark. Who is it?" "Well, he doesn't have a name in the schedule. He's a boy, looks about 17, and he's barefoot and a bit dirty. He says he can fix Mr. Anderson's Lamborghini." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. Robert Anderson's red Lamborghini Huracan had been in the maintenance department for 3 weeks, challenging the skills of the best mechanics in Los Angeles. The engine had developed a mysterious problem that even certified technicians couldn't diagnose. The car was worth over $2 million, and each day it spent in the shop represented a stain on the impeccable reputation that the Sanders family had built over decades. "Tell him that," Elizabeth began, but something made her stop. Perhaps it was the sharp intuition she had inherited from her father, or simply the desperation of someone willing to try anything. "Actually, let him come up, but ask Mark to accompany him." 5 minutes later, Elizabeth heard uneven footsteps on the wooden stairs leading to her office. First came the heavy thuds of Mark's security boots. The head mechanic, a 50-year-old man, short and stocky, with a graying moustache and hands eternally stained with grease. Then came lighter, almost silent steps. When the door opened, Elizabeth felt as if time had stopped. The boy who entered her office couldn't have been more than 17, but his dark brown eyes carried a maturity that starkly contrasted with his appearance. He was thin, almost skeletal, with messy dark hair and clothes that had seen better days, a yellowed white t-shirt with holes in the seams and faded jeans with homemade patches at the knees. His bare feet were dirty, but Elizabeth noticed he had tried to clean them before coming up. "Good afternoon, ma'am." The boy's voice was surprisingly polite, with an accent that hinted at humble origins, yet devoid of any signs of shyness or submission. He stood tall, his eyes fixed on hers. "My name is Lucas Thompson. I heard you have a Lamborghini with engine problems." Mark let out a harsh laugh. "Miss Elizabeth, forgive the kid's audacity. I told Mark it was a waste of time, but he insisted." "Let him speak, Mark." Elizabeth was surprised by her own response. There was something in Lucas's gaze that intrigued her, a quiet confidence that didn't match his vulnerable appearance. Lucas stepped forward, his calloused hands coming together in front of his body. "Ma'am, I know my appearance doesn't inspire confidence. I know you must be thinking I'm just another kid trying to take advantage of the situation, but I can prove that I know about engines." "And how did you learn about mechanics, kid?" Mark crossed his arms, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Taking a course on YouTube?" For a brief moment, Lucas's mask of confidence faltered, and Elizabeth glimpsed something akin to pain in his eyes. "I learned from Mr. Thompson, who worked here at Sanders for 15 years. He taught me everything I know about imported engines." The name hit Elizabeth like a punch in the stomach. Mr. Thompson had been one of the best mechanics the dealership had ever had, specializing in Lamborghini and Ferrari. He had also been fired for cause 3 years earlier, accused of stealing valuable parts, a situation that had always made Elizabeth uncomfortable, as the evidence had never been completely conclusive. Mark visibly tensed. Mr. Thompson, that thief who was stealing parts from the company. Mr. Thompson never stole anything. Lucas's voice now carried a firmness that thickened the air in the room. He is an honest man who was wronged, and he taught me that a true mechanic listens to what the engine is trying to say. Elizabeth stood up from her chair, her heart racing. Through the window she could see the red Lamborghini parked in the service area, like a terminally ill patient that all the doctors had given up on curing. The financial pressures of the business weighed on her shoulders like an invisible burden. The dealership's reputation was at stake, and each day of delay meant another step toward the ruin of the business that 3 generations of her family had built. "Mark, take him to the Lamborghini." Her own voice surprised her, firm and resolute. "But don't leave his side for a second." "Miss Sanders, with all due respect," Mark began to protest. "It's an order, Mark." Elizabeth maintained the authoritative tone she had learned to use when she needed to impose her will. "If he damages anything, I will take full responsibility." Lucas smiled for the first time since he entered the room. A shy but genuine smile that completely transformed his expression. "Thank you for the opportunity, ma'am. You won't regret it." As she watched the two descend the stairs, Elizabeth felt a mix of anxiety and hope that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the clouds, creating golden reflections on the wet asphalt of the street. The maintenance department of Sanders Luxury Cars occupied the entire basement of the building, a spacious and well-lit environment where the smell of motor oil mingled with the metallic aroma of freshly polished tools. White fluorescence created a clinical light over the organized workbenches, where German diagnostic equipment coexisted with traditional tools that seemed to have crossed generations of mechanics. Lucas descended the concrete steps with measured steps, his eyes scanning every detail of the environment. Even barefoot, he moved with a familiarity that did not go unnoticed by Mark, who followed closely with his arms crossed and a look of distrust etched on his tanned and sweaty face. "There she is, the beauty." Mark pointed to the red Lamborghini Huracan that dominated the center of the workshop like a piece of modern art. The hood was open, revealing the V8 engine that had become the nightmare of the past 3 weeks. 3 of the best mechanics in Los Angeles have already laid hands on her. The last was Charles, from the official Lamborghini dealership, who has 20 years of experience. Nothing. Lucas approached the vehicle with an almost religious reverence, his hands extended but not yet touching the gleaming metal. The engine was impeccably clean, a sign that it had been disassembled and reassembled several times. Organized parts in metal trays beside the car told the story of a frustrated investigation. "What's the problem?" Lucas asked, his voice now lower, as if he were in a library. "The engine stutters at high RPM, loses power after 4,000 RPM. We've already replaced the fuel pump, filters, spark plugs, coils." Mark enumerated the items with the weariness of someone who had repeated this list hundreds of times. "The injection system has been completely reviewed, the oxygen sensor replaced, mapping redone twice." Lucas finally placed his hands on the side of the engine, closing his eyes as if he were listening to an intimate confession. His calloused palms, dark with accumulated dirt, contrasted sharply with the immaculate red of the Lamborghini. For a few seconds he remained still, breathing slowly. "Can I start it?" Mark hesitated, looking up toward Elizabeth's office. "You can, but be careful not to force it. The engine has already gone through a lot of stress." When Lucas turned the key, the V8 roared to life with a throaty growl that echoed off the concrete walls of the workshop. The sound was powerful, but there was something subtle, almost imperceptible, that seemed out of tune. Lucas tilted his head, like a musician trying to identify a wrong note in a symphony. "Mark, can you rev it up to 3,000 RPM and hold it?" Lucas asked, his eyes still closed, focused. The mechanic complied, and the engine responded perfectly, maintaining a steady, vibrant roar. Lucas then signaled to rev it higher. At 4,000 RPM, the sound changed subtly, an almost inaudible irregularity that became more pronounced as the RPM increased. "You can shut it off." Lucas opened his eyes, a thoughtful expression taking over his young face. "The problem isn't in the fuel system." "Of course it isn't," Mark scoffed. "Anyone knows that. We've checked everything." "No, you don't understand." Lucas crouched beside the engine, pointing to a specific area. "The problem isn't in any system. It's here, in the block." Mark leaned in, frowning. "In the block? Kid, this engine has less than 10,000 kilometers. The block doesn't have issues like that." "It can." Lucas ran his fingers over an apparently normal area. "Of the metal. Mr. Thompson taught me that when the problem only appears at high RPM and has no apparent cause, it could be an internal micro-crack in the block. Pressure builds, the metal expands a little, and then... That's impossible to detect without specialized equipment," Mark interrupted, but his voice had lost some of its initial arrogance. "And even if it were that, it would be a manufacturing defect." "Exactly," Lucas smiled, standing up and wiping his hands on his already dirty pants. "Manufacturing defect, that's why no mechanic could solve it. You were looking for something that could have broken, not something that was already broken when it came from Italy." At that moment, footsteps echoed down the stairs. Elizabeth descended to the basement, followed by Mariana and two curious salespeople who had heard rumors about the mechanic kid. The businesswoman was now wearing a beige wool coat over her blazer, and her leather flats made a sharp sound against the concrete floor. "So?" Elizabeth asked, trying to disguise the anxiety in her voice. "Did you discover anything?" Lucas looked directly at her, not averting his gaze even in front of the small audience that had formed. "Ma'am, the problem is a manufacturing defect in the engine block, an internal micro-crack that only manifests under high pressure." An awkward silence filled the workshop. Mark scratched his mustache, clearly uncomfortable. The salespeople exchanged skeptical glances. "Kid," said Charles, a 50-year-old salesman with grey hair and a navy suit, "what you're saying is very serious. A manufacturing defect in a Lamborghini means a global recall, million-dollar compensations." "I know," Lucas maintained firmness in his voice, "but it's the truth. And if you want, I can prove it." Elizabeth felt her heart race. If Lucas was right, this would not only solve the problem with the Lamborghini, but could also result in substantial compensation from the Italian manufacturer. On the other hand, if he was wrong, the dealership's reputation would suffer even more. "How do you prove something like that?" Elizabeth asked. "With a specific pressure test on the block, you need to disassemble the engine almost completely and use equipment that most shops don't have." Lucas pointed to a corner of the workshop where more sophisticated tools were located. "But you do have it, that blue machine over there." Mark followed the boy's gaze, his eyes widening. "That's a hydrostatic, a pressure tester for engine blocks. It costs over $100,000. How on earth do you know what that is?" Mr. Thompson showed me how to use it. He said it was the most important tool in the shop, but most mechanics don't even know what it's for. Elizabeth observed Lucas with renewed attention. There was something in the boy's confidence that transcended his humble appearance. His words carried the weight of experience, even coming from someone so young. "How long do you need?" she asked. "About 6 hours to disassemble, test and reassemble everything. If I'm right, you'll have the proof you need to take action against Lamborghini. If I'm wrong," Lucas shrugged, "at least you'll know you tried everything." Mark shook his head. "Ms. Sanders, this is crazy. Letting a street kid disassemble a $2 million engine?" "He won't be working alone." Elizabeth made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "Mark, you will supervise every move. Sarah, cancel all my afternoon appointments. We're going to find out if this boy really knows about Lamborghinis." Outside, the Los Angeles sun had conquered the morning clouds, and through the small windows of the basement, golden rays illuminated the metallic red of the Lamborghini, as if fortune itself was shining on this moment of decision. The next 6 hours transformed Sanders' luxury cars into a theater where a spectacle of precision and tension unfolded. Lucas worked with the methodology of a surgeon, every movement calculated, each part removed, with almost religious reverence. His small, nimble hands danced among the tools as if he was born for this, while Mark watched him with a growing mix of surprise and reluctant respect. The V8 engine of the Lamborghini was disassembled piece by piece, revealing its innermost secrets. Elizabeth had come down to the basement 3 times during the afternoon, always finding Lucas focused on his task, sweating under the intense workshop lights. With each visit, she noticed a small group of employees gathering around the Lamborghini, whispering among themselves about the prodigy boy who had appeared out of nowhere. "Be careful with that gasket, kid," Mark murmured for the 10th time, his own hands trembling slightly as he held a delicate part. "If you damage that, it's $20,000. "I know, Mr. Mark," Lucas replied without taking his eyes off his work. "Mr. Thompson taught me that every part has its personality. This one is a bit temperamental. It needs care." As the sun began to set over Los Angeles, painting the sky in orange hues that filtered through the basement windows, Lucas finally exposed the engine block completely naked. The heart of the Lamborghini was there, vulnerable and exposed, its inner walls gleaming under the light of the halogen lamps. "Now comes the important part." Lucas wiped his hands on a clean cloth that Mark had offered. "Let's connect the pressure tester." The blue equipment that had caught his attention was an imposing machine, with cables and hoses that looked like they belonged in a hospital. Mark helped connect the sensors to the specific points on the block, following the precise instructions Lucas gave with disconcerting ease. "Initial pressure, 15 bar," Lucas announced, turning a dial on the equipment. The digital gauge began to rise slowly. "Normal. Let's go to 25. Elizabeth had come down again and was now standing next to Charles and Sarah, all watching in silence. The tension in the air was palpable. If Lucas was wrong, the Lamborghini would have been disassembled for nothing, and the dealership's reputation would take another hit. If he was right, 30 bar, Lucas announced, his eyes fixed on the gauge. "Still stable. Mark, can you write down the numbers I call out?" The older mechanic grabbed a clipboard, his hands now completely free of any hostility. There was something hypnotizing about the boy's absolute concentration. 40 bar, 45, 50. Lucas continued to raise the pressure, his voice remaining calm, even as small beads of sweat began to appear on his young forehead. Suddenly, a subtle sound was heard, a whisper almost inaudible, like air escaping from a flat tire. The digital gauge flickered for a fraction of a second. "There!" Lucas pointed to a specific area of the block. 52 bar. "Gentlemen, we have our crack." Mark leaned over the engine, using a powerful flashlight to examine the indicated spot. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he let out a low whistle. "Son of a gun," he murmured, then looked at Elizabeth with a genuinely astonished expression. "Miss Sanders, he's right. There's a microscopic crack here. It's invisible to the naked eye, but it's here." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic outside. Elizabeth felt her legs weaken and leaned against the tool bench. Lucas had accomplished in 6 hours what the best mechanics in the city couldn't do in 3 weeks. "That means," Elizabeth began, her voice faltering, "that means Lamborghini will have to compensate the dealership and the customer for a manufacturing defect." Charles finished, his own voice laden with disbelief. "We're talking about at least $5 million in compensation." Lucas began to meticulously clean his tools, as if what had just happened was routine. Mr. Thompson always said that when the Italians do something wrong, they wholesale. They probably have other cars with the same issue. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Production batch, ma'am," Lucas explained, putting each tool back in its specific place. "If one block came out defective from the assembly line, others from the same period probably did too. The manufacturer will have to investigate all the engines produced that week." Mark shook his head slowly. "Kid, in 15 years of mechanics, I've never seen anything like this. You have a gift." Lucas stopped what he was doing and looked directly at Mark. For a moment, his confident facade crumbled, revealing the vulnerability of a teenager who had grown up too fast. "It's not a gift, Mr. Mark. It's hunger." His voice carried a weight that silenced everyone. "When you have nothing, you need to learn to listen to what things are trying to tell you. An engine speaks if you know how to listen." Elizabeth stepped closer to the boy, her heart racing. "Lucas, where are you living?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, his eyes wandering around the workshop as if searching for an escape. "Here and there, Mom. Los Angeles has plenty of places to sleep if you know where to look." "That's not an answer," Elizabeth insisted, her voice taking on a maternal tone that surprised everyone. "Do you have family? Guardians?" Lucas refocused on the tools, but Elizabeth noticed his hands trembling slightly. "I have Mr. Thompson. He took care of me after my mom died." "And where is Mr. Thompson now?" "Around." Lucas shrugged, but the pain in his voice was unmistakable. "After he lost his job here, things got tough. Alcohol, you know how it is, but he still teaches me when he's sober." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Elizabeth looked around the workshop, at Mark, who was watching Lucas with growing respect, at Charles and Sarah, who seemed to have witnessed something extraordinary, at the disassembled Lamborghini that represented not just a problem solved, but a revelation about what was possible when talent was given a chance, regardless of its packaging. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, creating a golden mosaic that stretched to the horizon. Los Angeles pulsed with its nighttime energy, a metropolis where dreams and nightmares walked side by side down the same avenues. "Lucas," Elizabeth finally said, her decision made, "you're having dinner with me tonight, and afterward we'll talk about your future." The Olive Garden, located in a trendy neighborhood, was a haven of fine dining where executives and entrepreneurs gathered for discussions that shaped corporate destinies. The exposed brick walls, adorned with black and white photographs of old Los Angeles, created a cozy atmosphere that contrasted with the formality of the business conducted between its tables. Elizabeth chose a table in the restaurant's most secluded corner, away from the curious glances that would inevitably turn toward Lucas. The boy had accepted the invitation hesitantly, but now walked beside her through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood with a quiet dignity that impressed her. She had insisted he stop by her place and take a shower before dinner, lending him a blue polo shirt and a pair of jeans from her teenage nephew. Even in clean clothes, Lucas maintained the alert posture of someone who grew up knowing danger could arise at any moment. "I've never been to a place like this," Lucas confessed when they sat down, his eyes scanning the elegant surroundings with a mix of admiration and discomfort. The tables covered with immaculate white tablecloths, the uniformed waiters circulating with silver trays, the low sound of civilized conversations. Everything seemed to belong to a world different from his. "Everyone has a first time for everything," Elizabeth replied, trying to sound casual as she watched Lucas leaf through the menu with almost scientific concentration. She noticed he silently moved his lips as he read, like someone who was still not entirely comfortable with more elaborate words. "Ms. Sanders," Lucas said after a few minutes, carefully closing the menu, "you don't have to do this. I know I'm different from the people who come to places like this." The boy's blunt honesty hit her like a punch in the stomach. Elizabeth leaned forward, her hands meeting over the table. "Lucas, you saved my business today. You solved a problem that had been keeping me up at night for weeks. That's worth much more than a dinner." "But it's not just about dinner, is it?" Lucas asked, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a perception that belied his age. "You're thinking of offering me something more? A job, perhaps?" Elizabeth hesitated. There was something unsettling about Lucas's ability to read situations, as if life had forced him to develop a sharp survival instinct. "I am thinking about it. You have exceptional talent. It would be a waste to leave you on the streets." Lucas leaned back in his chair, a dark expression passing over his young face. "And what do you expect in return?" The question, asked with painful maturity, revealed to Elizabeth how many disappointments that boy had already faced, how many times well-meaning people had approached him with promises that turned out to be empty or self-serving. "Nothing more than what any employer would expect," she replied sincerely. "Dedication, honesty, a willingness to learn." "And what about the other? Employees? How will they react when they find out the boss hired a street kid?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. Lucas's question touched on a sensitive point she had tried to ignore. Mark had already shown resistance, and she could imagine the reactions of the salespeople and managers when they learned of her decision. "That's my problem, not yours," she said firmly. "My company, my rules." The waiter approached, a well-dressed middle-aged man with slicked-back grey hair. Elizabeth ordered shrimp risotto and a bottle of white wine. Lucas chose the simplest dish. On the menu, a grilled steak with potatoes. "Tell me about Mr. Thompson," Elizabeth said after the waiter walked away. "How did you meet?" Lucas fiddled with the cloth napkin, his fingers tracing nervous patterns on the white fabric. "My mother died when I was 14. Cancer." His voice was low, controlled. "We had no relatives, nowhere to go. I spent a few months on the streets, sleeping in shelters, collecting recyclables." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten, but forced herself to maintain a neutral expression, sensing that Lucas couldn't bear pity. "It was one of those nights, downtown, that I found Mr. Thompson. He was drunk, crying, on a bench in the park, talking to himself about how he had been wronged. When he saw I was listening, he started telling me about cars, about what it was like to work at Sanders Luxury Cars." Lucas paused as the sommelier brought the wine, waiting for Elizabeth to taste and approve before continuing. "He said I seemed smart, that if I wanted, I could learn to work on cars. At first, I thought it was just drunk talk, but the next day he showed up sober, with an old toolbox, and took me to a junkyard in East Los Angeles." "And he taught you there?" "For 2 years. Lucas smiled for the first time since they had sat down, an expression that completely transformed his face. The owner of the junkyard was his friend. He let us work on the abandoned cars. Mr. Thompson taught me that a motor is like a person. Each has its personality, its problems, its weaknesses. Dinner arrived, and for a few minutes they ate in silence. Elizabeth noticed that Lucas used the cutlery carefully but without shyness, like someone who had watched others do it and learned by imitation. "Why was he fired from Sanders?" Elizabeth finally asked, asking the question that had been haunting her since the afternoon. Lucas stopped chewing, his eyes hardening. Someone was stealing parts from the dealership. Expensive parts. Fuel systems, onboard computers, turbines. Mr. Thompson was the longest-serving employee. He knew all the access codes, so when they discovered the theft, he was the scapegoat. Exactly. Lucas nodded gravely. But he told me he knew who the real thief was. He said he had proof, but no one wanted to listen. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. And who did he think it was? Lucas hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. Someone from management, someone with access to the inventory control systems. That's a very serious accusation, Lucas. I know. The boy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. But Mr. Thompson showed me some things before he started drinking heavily. Numbers that didn't add up, false requisitions, deliveries that never happened. Elizabeth felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. If Lucas was telling the truth, it meant that her father's company had been corrupted from within, and an innocent man had been destroyed to cover up the guilt of the real criminal. "Do you still have that proof?" Lucas shook his head sadly. "Mr. Thompson burned everything one night when he was very drunk. He said it was pointless to fight the system anymore." Outside, the Los Angeles night pulsed with its characteristic energy. The sound of passing cars mixed with the lively conversations of other restaurant patrons. But at the corner table, two completely different worlds met in a conversation that would change both their lives forever. "Lucas," Elizabeth finally said, "tomorrow you start working at Sanders. Apprentice salary, but with all the labor. Guarantees. And I want you to tell me everything you remember about your conversations with Mr. Thompson." The boy studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher her true intentions. "Are you sure? This could bring trouble." "I'm sure." Elizabeth raised her wineglass in a silent toast. "Sometimes, doing the right thing is the only option we have left." The alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning in the small apartment that Elizabeth had rented for Lucas in East Los Angeles, just a few kilometers from the dealership. The place was simple: one bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. But it represented the first real home the boy had since his mother's death. Lucas had spent the previous night organizing his few belongings. 2 sets of clothes that Elizabeth had bought, the technical manuals that Mr. Thompson had given him, and a faded photo of his mother that he always carried in his pocket. At exactly 7 o'clock, Lucas was at the dealership door, wearing the navy blue uniform of Sanders that Elizabeth had provided. The fabric still smelled new, and the safety boots made a different sound against the marble floor of the reception area. Sarah greeted him with a genuine smile, but Lucas noticed the curious glances and some whispers among the employees arriving for another day of work. "Good morning, Lucas," Elizabeth said, coming down the stairs with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She wore a dark grey suit that accentuated her natural authority. "Ready for your first day?" "Ready, Miss Sanders," Lucas replied, unconsciously straightening his posture. "Mark is waiting for you in the office. He will guide you on safety procedures and company routines." When Lucas went downstairs, he found Mark organizing, tools on a workbench, but immediately noticed he wasn't alone. 3 mechanics were gathered around the coffee machine, their voices low but tense. The conversation abruptly ceased when they saw him arrive. "Everyone, Mark announced with forced formality. "This is Lucas. He will be working with us starting today." Robert, a 40-year-old mechanic with tattooed arms and a prominent belly, was the first to speak up. "So it's true. The boss hired the street kid who messed with the Lamborghini. I have a name," Lucas said calmly but firmly, "and I intend to earn my place here like anyone else." "Earn?" Paul, younger, just over 25. Lucas let out a rough laugh. "Man, you've already skipped 3 years of technical school. You started with a Lamborghini when we here are scratching our heads over civics." Lucas felt the hostility in the air like a toxic fog, but he kept his cool. He had faced worse situations on the streets. "You guys are right," he said, surprising everyone. "I don't have a diploma, I didn't take any courses, I haven't paid my dues with simple cars, but I'm here to learn, not to steal anyone's spot." Mark, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, clapped once. "All right, enough talk. We have work to do. Lucas, you're going to start with basic maintenance. Oil changes, filters, simple inspections." The third mechanic, Edelson, a thin 50-year-old with grey hair, finally spoke up. "Just one question, kid. Is it true you knew Mr. Thompson?" The name dropped like a bomb in the room. Lucas saw Mark stiffen, and the other two mechanics exchanged significant glances. "I did know him. He taught me everything I know about engines." "So you know what he did," Robert said, crossing his arms. "He stole from the company for years. He embarrassed all of us honest mechanics." "Mr. Thompson never stole anything," Lucas retorted, his voice gaining a firmness that made the atmosphere even more tense. "He was wronged." "Wronged?" Paul laughed again, but this time with less humor. "Man, they caught him red-handed. Parts disappearing, inventory tampered with." "They made him a scapegoat," Lucas corrected, stepping forward. "The real thief is still out there." A heavy silence fell over the shop. Mark stepped between Lucas and the other mechanics. "Enough, that's old news. Let's work." But Lucas noticed something in Edelson's eyes, a flicker of something that looked like fear. Or guilt. The next 2 hours passed in a charged atmosphere. Lucas was assigned to change the oil of a BMW 3 Series, a task he executed with the same precision he had shown with the Lamborghini. The other mechanics watched him discreetly, looking for mistakes, hoping he would fail, but his hands moved confidently, following procedures that Mr. Thompson had taught him until they became second nature. Around 10 o'clock, Elizabeth came down to the shop for a routine inspection. Lucas noticed that her presence completely changed the dynamic. The mechanics straightened up, conversation ceased, and an automatic respect settled in the air. "How's it going?" she asked Mark, but her eyes fixed on Lucas, who was closing the hood of the BMW with precise movements. "Well, Miss Sanders, the kid has a good hand," Mark admitted reluctantly. "Great. Lucas, when you finish up, come to my office. We have some papers to sign." When Elizabeth went back upstairs, Robert approached Lucas, his expression more serious now. "Listen here, kid. I don't know what story you told the boss, but down here things work differently. You might have impressed her with your Lamborghini magic, but to us, you're just another apprentice." "I understand," Lucas replied calmly. "I'm not asking for special treatment." "Good," Paul chimed in, "because you won't get any. And another thing, stop talking about Mr. Thompson like he was a saint. The guy was a thief. End of story." Lucas felt anger rise in his chest like hot lava, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "You didn't know Mr. Thompson like I did." "We did know him," Edelson said, his voice strangely tense. "We worked with him for years. We knew exactly what kind of person he was. There was something in the way Edelson spoke that made Lucas pay attention, a subtle emphasis, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as the others. "It must have been hard for you," Lucas said carefully, "to find out a co-worker was stealing." "It was," Robert quickly agreed. "That's why we don't like it when someone comes to defend a thief." But Lucas was watching Edelson and noticed the older man avoiding his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he organized tools that were already perfectly arranged. At that moment, a suspicion began to form in Lucas's mind, a suspicion about who really had stolen from Sanders and why Mr. Thompson had been chosen as the scapegoat. 20 minutes later, when Lucas went up to Elizabeth's office to sign the hiring papers, he had already made a decision. He would not just be an employee at the dealership, he would be the instrument of justice that Mr. Thompson never had. "Is everything all right?" Elizabeth asked, noticing the thoughtful expression on the boy's face. "Are the other mechanics treating you well?" Lucas hesitated for a moment, then decided to be partially honest. "They're testing my resilience. It's normal. If anyone disrespects you, you let me know." "All right. You got it, Miss Sanders." Lucas picked up the pen to sign the documents, but before he did, he asked, "Do you still have the files from when Mr. Thompson was fired?" Elizabeth frowned. "I do. Why?" "Just curious." Lucas signed his name carefully, each letter formed with precision. "Maybe one day you can show me." 3 weeks had passed since Lucas started working at Sanders, and his reputation among clients was growing remarkably. Ms. Johnson, owner of a BMW 3 Series with intermittent electrical issues, had specifically insisted that the mechanic kid examine her car after 2 other professionals failed to diagnose the problem. Businessman Marcio Fontana had brought his Audi R8 straight from the official dealership after Lucas identified a noise over the phone that the German technicians couldn't locate. It was a rainy Friday in April when Elizabeth finally decided to show Lucas the files he had mentioned. Her office on the 2nd floor was bathed in the grey light of the Los Angeles afternoon, and the sound of rain against the windows created a melancholic soundtrack for what was about to unfold. "The files are in the storage room," Elizabeth said, holding a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. "Are you sure you want to dig into this? Some truths are hard to digest." Luke, still wearing the workshop uniform with some grease stains, nodded gravely. "I need to know, Miss Sanders. For Mr. Thompson. He didn't deserve what they did to him." The storage room was on the top floor of the building, a spacious area where cardboard boxes piled up to the ceiling, organized by year and department. The smell of old paper and mildew dominated the environment, mixed with the aroma of wood from the roof structure. A single fluorescent light illuminated the central aisle between the shelves. Here, Elizabeth pointed to a row of boxes marked 2021-2022, HR and Administration. "Everything related to Mr. Thompson's case is in these 3 boxes." Luke opened the first box with reverent care, as if handling sacred relics. Documents, reports, inventory control spreadsheets, all the bureaucratic paperwork of an internal investigation that had destroyed a man's life. "Can I take this somewhere brighter?" Luke asked. "Let's go to the conference room. There's a big table there." 20 minutes later, the mahogany table in the conference room was covered with stacks of documents organized chronologically. Luke had developed his own analysis system, sorting the papers into categories: inventory reports, parts orders, entry and exit logs, and employee testimonies. "Look at this," Luke said, pointing to an inventory control spreadsheet dated March 2022. "It says 2 electronic control units for Lamborghini left on the 15th. Total value $80,000. Elizabeth leaned over the table, adjusting her reading glasses. "And what's the problem?" "Here," Luke showed another document. "Service order from the same day. Only 1 Lamborghini in the shop, and it didn't need an electronic control unit. It had a cooling system issue. It could have been preventive stock." "No." Luke shook his head, picking up more papers. "Look here, requisition signed by Edward authorizing the removal of the parts. And here, delivery confirmation to a non-existent address." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, non-existent?" Luke had pulled out a smartphone from his pocket, a simple device that Elizabeth had bought for him after hiring him. "I searched the address on GPS. Antonio Street, 1547, East Los Angeles. The number doesn't exist. The street ends at 1200. A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the rain intensified, and occasional lightning illuminated the dark afternoon sky. "Are you suggesting that Edward—" "I'm suggesting that someone set up a very elaborate scheme," Luke gently interrupted, "and chose Mr. Thompson as a scapegoat because he was the most senior employee, had access to everything, and no one would suspect such a respected man." Elizabeth picked up another set of documents, her hands trembling slightly. "Here's Edward's testimony during the investigation. He was the one who raised the first suspicions about Mr. Thompson." Luke read the testimony with growing attention. "Look how interesting. Edward says he noticed suspicious behavior from Mr. Thompson in recent months, that he arrived early and left late for no apparent reason, that he was using the computers outside of working hours. And that's not suspicious? It is, if you don't know that Mr. Thompson was studying." Luke smiled sadly. "He told me he was taking an online course in electronic diagnostics. He wanted to keep up with the evolution of technology. That's why he stayed after hours, using the company's computers to study." Elizabeth stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain run down the glass. "If you're right, that means Edward. Means he not only stole from the company for years, but also destroyed an innocent man's life to cover his crimes. But why did he choose Mr. Thompson?" Luke gathered some specific papers before answering. "Because Mr. Thompson was getting close to the truth. Look here, 3 days before the first accusation, Mr. Thompson sent an email to the administrative department questioning discrepancies in the inventory. He had noticed that some parts were leaving the system but never reaching the cars." Elizabeth returned to the table, her face pale. "My father always said that Mr. Thompson had an eagle eye for details. Edward realized he would be discovered, so he flipped the situation, accused the accuser." Luke organized the documents into a neat stack. "It's a classic scheme. When you're being investigated, the best defense is to attack first. Are you sure about that?" "I'm more than sure." Luke pulled out a folder he had saved for last. "I found this at the bottom of the box. Looks like someone forgot to destroy it." It was a series of printed emails dated 2 weeks before Mr. Thompson's dismissal. The conversation was between Edward and an external email address discussing problems with the supplier and the need to accelerate the change of route. "This isn't about legitimate parts," Elizabeth murmured, reading the emails. "They're talking about organized theft." "And there's more," Luke pointed to the last email in the series. "Edward writes, 'The old man is suspicious. I need to resolve this soon or we're all going down.' And the reply, 'You know what to do. We have contacts that can help with the necessary documentation.'" Elizabeth felt the world spin around her. Necessary documentation to forge evidence against Mr. Thompson. Exactly. Luke leaned back in his chair, looking older than his 17 years. Mr. Thompson wasn't just innocent. He was the only person who could have exposed the entire network. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain and traffic outside. Elizabeth looked at the young man in front of her, the boy who had arrived barefoot and dirty, offering to fix a Lamborghini, and who had now uncovered a conspiracy that cost the dignity and life of a good man. "Luke," she finally said, her voice heavy with emotion, "what do we do now?" "Now," Luke replied, his eyes shining, "with a fierce determination, we seek justice." The following Monday dawned with a radiant sun. The weight of the weekend's discoveries contrasted dramatically with the calm of the morning. Elizabeth had spent the entire Sunday on the phone with Richard Moore, her personal attorney, a 50-year-old man with greying hair and an impeccable reputation in business law. Now, at 8 in the morning, Richard was sitting in her office, studying the documents that Luke had organized with almost scientific precision. "Elizabeth, this is explosive," Richard said, adjusting his glasses to better read one of the printed emails. "If we can prove that this evidence is authentic, not only will we clear Mr. Thompson's name, but we will also have a solid criminal case against Edward." "If we can prove?" Elizabeth asked, pouring coffee into white porcelain cups. "Do you have doubts about the authenticity?" "Not about the authenticity of the documents themselves, but an experienced defense attorney could argue that they were planted, manipulated, or taken out of context." Richard drummed his fingers on the mahogany table. "We need more evidence, something irrefutable." It was at that moment that Luke appeared at the door, wearing an impeccably clean navy blue uniform, his hair still damp from his morning shower. "Excuse me, Miss Sanders, you asked me to come up?" "Come in, Luke. This is Dr. Richard Moore, our attorney. Richard, this is Luke, the young man who uncovered this entire situation." Richard extended his hand to Luke, studying the boy with professional interest. "Nice to meet you. Elizabeth told me about your investigative skills." Luke shook the offered hand firmly. "The pleasure is mine, Doctor. You mentioned we needed more evidence." "Exactly," Elizabeth replied. "Dr. Richard thinks what we have may not be enough to secure a conviction." Luke nodded, thoughtfully, then smiled, a smile that carried a predatory edge. "Then we'll get more evidence." "How?" Richard asked, intrigued. "With a trap." Luke approached the table where the documents were spread out. "Edward doesn't know we've uncovered his scheme. He still thinks he's safe. We can use that against him." "What kind of trap?" Elizabeth asked, recognizing the gleam in Luke's eyes, the same one she had seen when he analyzed the engine of the Lamborghini. Luke picked up one of the emails and pointed to the email address of Edward's external contact. "This address is still active. I checked. If someone sent an email pretending to be a new client interested in stolen parts, that would be entrapment." Richard interrupted immediately. "Admissible in court. Not if the police aren't involved," Luke replied calmly, "and not if the person conducting the investigation is the actual victim of the crime." Richard and Elizabeth exchanged meaningful glances. The boy had clearly thought of every angle. "Go on," Elizabeth said. "Edward has meetings with suppliers every Tuesday morning, right? He'll be out of the office for at least 2 hours. In the meantime, we can access his computer, send some strategic emails, and see how he reacts." "That's an invasion of privacy," Richard noted, but his voice carried more curiosity than objection. "Not if the computer belongs to the company and we're investigating crimes against the company itself," Luke corrected. "Ms. Sanders has every right to check how her equipment is being used." Elizabeth was once again surprised by the boy's legal insight. "Where did you learn about these legal matters?" "On the street you learn that knowledge is power," Luke replied simply. "And when you don't have money for a lawyer, you need to understand how the system works on your own." Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. "And what exactly would the plan be?" Luke walked over to the whiteboard that Elizabeth used for presentations and grabbed a marker. With precise movements, he began to draw a diagram. "First step, we create a false identity, a businessman interested in buying imported parts without invoices. Second step, we contact Edward's partner using information that only someone inside the company would know. Third step, we wait for the reaction." "And if Edward finds out it was us?" Elizabeth asked. "He won't find out," Luke replied confidently, "because he'll be too busy trying to cover his own tracks." Elizabeth's phone rang at that moment. It was Sarah from reception. Miss Sanders, Edward is downstairs asking to speak with you. He says it's urgent. Elizabeth, Richard, and Luke exchanged glances. It was as if the universe was conspiring in their favor. "Tell him I'll be up in 10 minutes, Elizabeth replied. Then, turning to Luke, "What an interesting coincidence." "It's not a coincidence," Luke said, his eyes narrowing. "I bet he found out we've been digging through the files. Someone must have mentioned we were here Friday afternoon." "How could he know what we found?" Richard asked. "He can't, but he knows we've been looking, and that's enough to make him nervous." Luke erased the board and put the marker away. "Ms. Sanders, when you talk to him, watch his hands. Nervous people have tics. They play with their hair, drum their fingers, rub their palms." Elizabeth nodded, then asked, "And you too?" "I'll go back to the shop and pretend nothing happened," Luke said. "Dr. Richard, can you stay here? If Edward tries anything drastic, it's better to have a witness." "Anything drastic like what?" Richard asked. Luke paused at the door, his expression serious. "Like trying to destroy the remaining evidence, or resigning before we find out." 20 minutes later, Elizabeth was sitting at her desk, watching Edward from across the room. The 50-year-old mechanic was visibly agitated, his hands moving constantly, adjusting his cap, fiddling with the zipper of his uniform, drumming his fingers on the arm of the chair. Just as Luke had predicted. "Ms. Sanders," Edward began, his voice a tone higher than normal, "I heard you've been going through the old files. I wanted to know if there's anything I can help with." "Help with what, Edward?" Elizabeth kept her voice neutral, but observed every movement of the man. "Well, I worked a long time with Mr. Thompson. I know how that situation was. Complicated for everyone." "Complicated how? How are you doing?" Edward swallowed hard, his eyes momentarily diverting. No one liked seeing a colleague doing that, but sometimes people do things we don't expect, right? Elizabeth nodded slowly, feeling her heart race. "Sometimes indeed, Edward. Sometimes indeed." The following Tuesday arrived with a thunderstorm, sweeping through Los Angeles like a harbinger of the events to come. Lightning cut through the grey sky, and the sound of thunder echoed through the halls of Sanders' luxury cars like drums announcing a battle. At 9 in the morning, Edward left for his weekly meeting with suppliers, his hurried steps betraying a nervousness he tried to conceal. Luke waited exactly 15 minutes before heading up from the workshop, carrying a toolbox as a pretext. Elizabeth and Richard were already in her office, surrounded by equipment that the lawyer had brought, a laptop, a small camera, and an audio recording device. "Did he leave?" Richard asked, adjusting his glasses while connecting the devices. 15 minutes ago, Luke confirmed, checking the clock. "We have at most an hour and a half before he returns." Edward's computer was on a desk in the corner of the administrative area, a spot that offered privacy but was still visible to anyone passing through the hallway. Luke sat in the worn leather chair, his young hands moving with surprising skill over the keyboard. "How do you know the password?" Elizabeth asked, watching the screens open rapidly. "I don't know," Luke replied, typing a sequence of numbers. "But I know people like Edward use obvious passwords: birth date, spouse's name, year of hiring." The screen unlocked on the third. Attempt. Done. Maria 1972, spouse's name and the year she was born. Richard shook his head, amazed. 20 years of criminal law, and I've never seen anything like this. Luke opened Edward's email program, his eyes quickly scanning the recent messages. Most were related to normal work, parts orders, technical reports, internal communications. But there was a separate folder, simply labeled Personal. "Here it is," Luke murmured, clicking on the folder. Dozens of emails appeared on the screen, all related to the theft scheme. The main contact was identified only as M. Santos, and there were exchanges of messages dated up to the previous week. My God, Elizabeth whispered, reading over Luke's shoulder. He never stopped. Even after Mr. Thompson's dismissal, he continued stealing. Luke clicked on one of the most recent messages. The conversation revealed sordid details of the scheme. Lists of valuable parts, fake delivery addresses, even instructions on how to alter records in the inventory system. "Richard, are you recording this?" Elizabeth asked. "Every second," the lawyer confirmed, adjusting the camera angle. "This is enough for a criminal conviction." Luke continued navigating through the emails until he found what he was looking for. A folder labeled Mr. Thompson. Inside, there was devastating evidence of the plan to frame the innocent mechanic, emails discussing how to plant false evidence, conversations about bribing someone from the administrative department to alter records, even a draft of a fabricated testimony. This one, Luke pointed to a specific email, was sent 3 days before the first accusation against Mr. Thompson. Look at what he writes. "The old man is very close to the truth. I need to steer the investigation away from me. Are you sure your contacts can forge the necessary documents?" Ms. Santos's response was even more incriminating. "Relax. We've done this before. An old and reliable mechanic is the perfect scapegoat. No one will question it." Elizabeth felt nausea take over her stomach. They destroyed a man's life as if it were a game. "And made millions from it," Luke added, opening a spreadsheet he found attached to one of the emails. "Look here, a detailed record of everything they stole over the last 3 years. The total amount exceeds $2 million. Richard stopped filming for a moment. "Luke, you need to copy all of this, not just film it, but do a complete backup." "I'm already doing it." Luke connected a USB drive to the computer. "I learned that digital evidence needs to be in at least 3 different places to be secure." It took 20 minutes to copy all the relevant files. While the transfer was happening, Luke opened Edward's instant messaging program. There they found real-time conversations with others involved in the scheme, including an administrative employee that Luke initially didn't recognize. "Wait," Elizabeth said, leaning closer to the screen. "This user, admin DF2, can Edward see who it is?" Luke clicked on the user's profile, and the full name appeared. David Ferreira, administrative. Assistant. "David," Elizabeth went pale. "He's worked here for 8 years, always considered a model employee." "Apparently modeling in the art of stealing," Richard commented dryly. At that moment, Luke's phone vibrated with a message. It was Mark from the workshop. "Edward is back early. He's coming up." "Crap," Luke murmured, his hands flying over the keyboard to close all programs and clear the browsing history. "He's back." "Can you erase the traces?" Richard asked, quickly packing up the equipment. "Done." Luke disconnected the USB drive and stood up from the chair. "The computer is exactly as it was when I arrived." Steps echoed in the hallway. Elizabeth signaled for Richard to hide behind a filing cabinet, while Luke quickly moved to a nearby workbench, pretending to organize tools. Edward appeared in the administrative area with a tense expression, his eyes immediately drawn to his computer. He stopped when he saw Luke. "What are you doing up here?" Edward's voice carried barely concealed suspicion. "Mark asked me to grab some wrenches that are kept here," Luke replied calmly, lifting a tool. "He needs them for Miss Johnson's BMW." Edward approached his computer and turned it on, checking to see if everything was normal. Luke watched every movement, noting that the man specifically checked the personal email folder. "Everything okay?" Luke asked with feigned innocence. "All good," Edward replied, but his voice sounded tense. "You can back to the shop now." Luke nodded and headed for the stairs, but not before exchanging a meaningful glance with Elizabeth, who was observing the scene from a distance. The trap had worked perfectly. They had all the evidence they needed. Now it was time to tighten the net. On Wednesday morning, A heavy atmosphere hung over the Sanders luxury cars dealership. Elizabeth had arrived earlier than usual, wearing a black suit that conveyed a solemn authority. On her desk, 2 folders organized by Richard contained copies of all the collected evidence. Next to them, a phone rested ominously. She had spent the night deciding whether to call the police first or confront the culprits directly. Luke was in the shop, working on a routine inspection, but his ears were tuned to every sound coming from upstairs. Mark had noticed his tension and had asked several times if everything was okay, always receiving the same response: just a little tired. At 10 o'clock, Elizabeth descended to the administrative area with firm, decisive steps. Employees looked up from their desks, instinctively sensing that something important was about to happen. She stopped in front of the desk of David Harris, a thin 35-year-old man with dark hair and a perpetually worried expression. "David, I need to speak with you in my office. Now." The administrative assistant visibly paled, his hands trembling as he saved the file he was working on. "Of course, Miss Sanders. Is something wrong?" "We'll find out together." Luke, who had quietly come up and positioned himself near the stairs, watched as David followed Elizabeth with uncertain steps. 5 minutes later, she returned alone and headed straight for Edward, who pretended to be focused on his computer screen. "Edward, you too. My office. 5 minutes." The older mechanic tried to maintain his composure, but Luke noticed his hands sweating as he saved his work and locked the computer. "Miss Sanders, if this is about last week's overtime, I can explain." "It's not about overtime." Elizabeth's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "It's about 3 years of systematic theft and the destruction of an innocent man's life." A deadly silence fell over the administrative area. Employees stopped typing, conversations ceased, even the sound of the air conditioning seemed louder. Edward froze for a few seconds, then tried to smile. "Ms. Sanders, I don't understand what you're talking about." "You'll understand in 5 minutes. My office." Luke discreetly followed, positioning himself near the door of Elizabeth's office. Inside, David was sitting in a chair, visibly nervous, while Richard organized documents on the desk. When Edward entered, the atmosphere became even tenser. "Sit down," Elizabeth ordered, her voice heavy with an authority neither of them had seen before. "Gentlemen, you know Dr. Richard Anderson, my lawyer. He has some questions to ask." Richard stood up, adjusted his glasses, and opened the first folder. "Gentlemen, over the past few days we have conducted an internal investigation into irregularities in inventory control. What we discovered was enlightening." David stared at his own hands, while Edward tried to maintain a defiant expression that did not match the sweat beginning to appear on his forehead. "First piece of evidence," Richard continued, pulling out a stack of printed emails, "electronic correspondence between the two of you and a third party, identified as M. Santos, discussing the sale of stolen parts from this company. This is an invasion of privacy," Edward protested, but his voice sounded desperate. "You can't access our emails." "We can, and we did," Elizabeth replied coldly. "All computers and communication systems in this company are the property of Sanders Luxury Cars. We have every legal right to monitor them." Richard placed more documents on the table. Second piece of evidence: altered records in the inventory system showing shipments of parts to non-existent addresses. Third piece of evidence: detailed spreadsheets of illegal sales, totaling over $2 million in 3 years. David finally spoke up, his voice barely audible. "Miss Sanders, I can explain." "Can you really?" Elizabeth leaned forward. "Then explain how a model administrative assistant turned into a thief." "I didn't want to," David exploded, tears starting to stream down his face. It was Edward. He threatened me, said that if I didn't cooperate, he would make up stories that I was stealing on my own." Edward turned to David in fury. "You son of a bitch! You were making the same amount as I was." "Shut up!" Richard intervened, his voice sharp. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Elizabeth stood up and walked to the window, watching the traffic on the street below. When she turned around, her expression was a mix of sadness and iron determination. "But the most disgusting part of all this," she said slowly, "was not the theft. It was what you did to Mr. Thompson." Edward tried to maintain a defiant posture. "Mr. Thompson was guilty. You fabricated evidence against an innocent man," Elizabeth exploded, her voice echoing off the office walls. "You destroyed the career, dignity, and life of a man who dedicated 15 years to this company." Richard pulled out more documents from the folder. "We have here your emails planning how to frame Mr. Thompson, conversations about planting false evidence, about bribing people to alter records, about how you chose him because he was the perfect scapegoat." David was now openly sobbing. "I didn't want to do this to Mr. Thompson. He was always good to me, taught me a lot when I started working here." "Then why did you do it?" Elizabeth asked, her voice heavy with pain. "Because he was finding everything out," Edward finally admitted, all his resistance crumbling. "The old man had an eye for detail. He was asking too many questions about the inventory. It was only a matter of time before he discovered our scheme. So you decided to destroy him first." "It was him or us!" Edward shouted, completely losing his composure. "You don't understand how hard it is to survive on a mechanic's salary in Los Angeles. The bills, the kids in private school, the mortgage. So you stole," Elizabeth said coldly. "And when they were discovered, they blamed an innocent man." At that moment, the office door opened and Luke entered, carrying an additional folder. "Ms. Sanders, I apologize for interrupting, but some important information has arrived." Elizabeth gestured for him to come closer. Luke opened the folder and pulled out some documents. "I managed to locate Mr. Thompson," he announced. "He is hospitalized at Los Angeles General Hospital, advanced liver cirrhosis." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth felt her heart break as David cried even louder. Even Edward seemed shaken by the news. Is he going to survive?" Elizabeth asked. Luke shook his head sadly. "The doctors don't know. He is very weakened. 3 years on the streets, drinking, without proper medical care." Elizabeth turned to Edward and David with an expression that mixed pain and anger. "Did you hear that? A man is dying because of your lies." "I want to confess everything," David suddenly said, standing up from his chair. "I want to clear Mr. Thompson's name. I'm going to the police. I'll testify. I'll do anything to fix this." Edward looked at his former accomplice with disdain. "You're a coward, David." "No," David replied, wiping his tears. "A coward is what I was for 3 years. Now I'm going to do the right thing." Elizabeth returned to her desk and picked up the phone. "Richard, can you call the police? We have 2 criminals to turn in." As Richard dialed, Luke approached Elizabeth. "Ms. Sanders, may I make a request?" "Of course, Luke." "I want to go with you to visit Mr. Thompson. He deserves to know that his name has been cleared." Elizabeth nodded, feeling tears welling in her eyes. "Let's go together. It's the least we can do for him." Outside, the sun in Los Angeles had finally won over the morning clouds, but for Elizabeth and Luke, the most important light would be the one they saw in the eyes of an innocent man when he learned that justice had finally triumphed. 6 months later, Sanders' luxury cars had transformed into something neither Elizabeth nor her father ever imagined. The scandal of the theft scheme, widely publicized by the Los Angeles media, initially threatened to destroy the company's reputation. But Elizabeth's total transparency during the investigations, her complete cooperation with the authorities, and the touching story of how a young mechanic had uncovered the corruption turned a crisis into an opportunity for renewal. Luke, now 18 years old, had become not only the youngest head mechanic in the history of the dealership, but also a symbol of a new business philosophy. Elizabeth had created the Mr. Thompson program, an initiative that offered free automotive mechanic training for young people in social vulnerability. The program operated in the renovated facilities in the company's basement, where old filing rooms were transformed into teaching workshops equipped with cutting-edge technology. It was a sunny October afternoon when Elizabeth climbed the stairs of Los Angeles General Hospital, carrying a folder with documents and a bouquet of yellow flowers, Mr. Thompson's favorites according to Luke. The former mechanic had survived cirrhosis but remained hospitalized for treatment. 3 months of intensive therapy had stabilized his condition, and for the first time in years, Mr. Thompson was sober and lucid. "Mr. Thompson," Luke said, entering the room with a radiant smile, "I brought a special visitor." The 62-year-old man was sitting in an armchair beside the bed, wearing a light blue hospital gown. His grey hair was combed, his beard trimmed, and although still thin, he had regained some of the sparkle in his eyes that Luke remembered from the early days of learning in the junkyard. "Miss Sanders?" Mr. Thompson struggled to rise, extending his hand. "It's an honor to have you here." "The honor is mine, Mr. Thompson." Elizabeth shook the offered hand firmly and respectfully. "I came to bring some things that belong to you." She opened the folder and pulled out an official document, the complete annulment of his dismissal for just cause, accompanied by a recommendation letter signed by her, officially recognizing his innocence and his 15 years of impeccable service to the company. "In addition," Elizabeth continued, pulling out another document, "Sanders acknowledges the moral and material damages you suffered due to the false accusations. This is a compensation check for $500,000. Mr. Thompson was silent for a few moments, holding the documents with slightly trembling hands. "Ms. Sanders, this is more than I ever expected." "It's nothing compared to what you lost," she replied sincerely, "but I hope it's a start for a new phase in your life." Luke approached his mentor, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And there's more, Mr. Thompson. Tell him, Ms. Sanders." Elizabeth smiled, the first genuinely joyful expression in her eyes throughout the conversation. "Mr. Thompson, when you fully recover, I would like to invite you to be the technical director of our new teaching program. Young people like Luke need to learn from someone who understands not only mechanics, but also dignity and honesty." Mr. Thompson was speechless, tears beginning to stream down his aged face. You want me to come back?" "We want you to come back home," Luke said, his own voice choked. "Sanders has always been your home. Now it will be officially." That night, Elizabeth was in her office finishing some reports when Luke knocked on the door. She invited him in and went to get 2 cups of coffee from the machine she had installed next to her desk. "How do you feel?" she asked, handing a cup to the young man. "Relieved," Luke replied, sitting in the chair in front of the desk. Seeing Mr. Thompson smile again, "It's priceless." "And you? Are you happy with the changes in the company?" Luke smiled, but there was a mature seriousness in his expression. "Ms. Sanders, may I ask a personal question?" "Of course." "Why did you do all this?" "After discovering the truth, you could have simply fired Edward and David, discreetly compensated Mr. Thompson, and left it at he. That. Why turn this into a public campaign?" Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, contemplating the question. "Because I've realized something important in these last few months, Luke. My father built this company on solid values, but when he passed away, I became so focused on keeping the business running that I forgot those values. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the lights of Los Angeles flicker on as night fell. Seeing what happened to Mr. Thompson, seeing how genuine talent can be found in the most unexpected places, like in your case, made me understand that a company is not just about profit. It's about people. It's about giving opportunities, about making a difference in people's lives. Luke nodded, understanding. And the teaching program? Oh, that. Elizabeth smiled, returning to her desk. That was your inspiration. When I saw how Mr. Thompson transformed a homeless boy into an exceptional mechanic using only knowledge and care, I realized we could do this on a larger scale. We already have 15 young people signed up for the first class, Luke proudly informed her. Most come from situations similar to mine, and all of them will have the opportunity to learn not just mechanics, but values, honesty, hard work, dignity. Elizabeth paused. Luke, there's something else I need to tell you. The young man looked at her with curiosity. I'm creating a profit-sharing fund for all employees. And you, besides being the head mechanic, will also be the coordinator of the teaching program, with a salary commensurate with your responsibilities. Luke was silent for a few seconds, then asked, Why? Why are you doing all this for me? Elizabeth smiled with maternal affection. Because you taught me that talent doesn't have a fixed address, that dignity doesn't depend on social origin, and that sometimes the most unlikely people can show us who we really are. 6 months earlier, when Luke had appeared barefoot at the dealership offering to fix a Lamborghini, neither Elizabeth nor he could have imagined how much that encounter would change their lives. Now, looking at the city pulsating outside, both knew they had built something much greater than a professional relationship. They had created a chosen family based on mutual respect and shared values, and more importantly, they had proven that when we give genuine talent a real chance, regardless of its packaging, we can not only transform individual lives, but create waves of change that spread far beyond what we initially imagined. The Sanders Luxury Cars dealership was no longer just a place where luxury cars were sold. It had become a symbol of second chances, of late justice, and of how the meeting of seemingly incompatible worlds can generate the most beautiful and lasting transformations. Outside, Los Angeles continued its nightly dance of lights and movement, but inside the office on the second floor of a building in South Los Angeles, 2 people who had met through the most improbable circumstances quietly celebrated the victory of dignity over prejudice, of truth over lies, and of hope over despair.